Well, we are talking about Baptist origins. Who are the Baptists? Where did they come from? When did they come from? What do they believe? Why are there so many Baptist denominations? All those sort of questions are natural questions and I think important questions for us to ask. You might be taking this class and you are a Baptist and you were raised a Baptist, and so you have a good amount, maybe, that you could say to answer this question. Some of you might have a very loose background. Maybe you've been a Baptist, but it wasn't necessarily emphasis. Maybe your church was felt like a more non-denominational church. You might have no Baptist background whatsoever. You might be a Presbyterian or a Pentecostal or again a non-denominational or Bible church Christian, and yet it's still helpful to have some grasp on these things because Baptists make up such a massive section of the body of Christ in the United States as well as globally. And the kinship that Baptists share with other evangelicals, with other Protestants, I think it's helpful for us to understand these things. But particularly if you yourself are a Baptist, I think that you should be asking yourself this question. And even if you feel like you have some sense of these sort of things, hopefully this is a fresh opportunity to just be reminded of them or to explore them together. So there are about 4 different ways that we could describe Baptist origins, or really I should say theories of Baptist origins. There are about 3 to 4 different approaches that historians have used that represent what Baptists have believed about themselves, as well as what historians have understood looking at the past, to basically say, where did the Baptists come from? And so the first one is an ancient theory. The fact that, or it's the idea that says that Baptists are ancient. Baptists have always existed since the time of the New Testament. This is a view that would have been prominent in earlier American Baptist life. So in the 19th century, for instance, up until the First or Second World War, this would have been a view that many Baptists would have held, as well as earlier than that, perhaps, as Baptists begin to try to understand where they came from. So it basically goes like this. John the Baptist and the apostles were Baptists without the name. Obviously, no one in the New Testament said, I am a Baptist. They didn't have to, is the way the argument would go, because they held these principles that Baptists hold. Baptists are Bible people. They've always existed. And so there is sort of an unbroken line throughout antiquity, throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the era of the Reformation into early modernity, and to present, there is an unbroken line of Baptists. Maybe they haven't always had that name. Maybe they have. It depends who you're talking to, how strict they would want to get with this. But they would say basically there have always been Baptists. There's a book that really encapsulates this argument. It's called The Trail of Blood. It was written by J.M. Carroll in the early 20th century, I believe 1931. And it really lays this view out, again, making this case that Baptists have always existed in this way. So this first theory of Baptist origins is that Baptists are ancient and have always been there since the time of the New Testament. That view is not prominent today and historically has significant problems. And as I kind of look at some of these other views, I think you'll see why. But there are some, I think there are still a few places in the United States that you can go, particularly rural places, some places that would even still have a denominational affiliation that would call itself landmarkist, which is a view that sort of put dogmatically this view that all faithful Christians, all apostolic New Testament Christians have been Baptists, and so thus there is this stronger sense. But these are very small movements and are no longer prominent in Baptist life, and yet I mentioned that there still are some. There's a denomination, for instance, in Arkansas and sort of the old Southwest that would hold this view, for instance. Number 2 is similar to the ancient view, that Baptists are ancient, but it's we often term it a spiritual kinship theory. And so it's the idea that maybe there hasn't always been an organic connection, sort of church to church, Christian to Christian, that has been Baptist, but rather that Baptists can look back through the eras of church history, through the Middle Ages and into antiquity, and find groups that basically more or less represented, or at least represented some of Baptist principles and Baptist priorities. And so Baptists can kind of look back and see themselves in the Waldensians or in the Donatists and so on and so forth. Now this view is a little bit easier because, of course, in the first view, historically, we just have so many gaps that where there don't seem to be, and there doesn't seem to be anyone who would fit this category. But with the spiritual kinship, it becomes a little bit easier to where you can look back and again see yourself, or at least some part of yourself, as a Baptist in these groups that have gone before. The problem with this view historically is that as you begin to look at some of these groups a little bit closer, some of them are heretical. They're strongly schismatic, many of them, and so on. You begin to look at, there seem to be some theological problems. If these were proto-Baptists of some sort, at the very least, even if there are some things that seem to be like-minded, there are other things that maybe we wouldn't want to own up to. And so, but that is the spiritual kinship view, and it would be held by some today. Still a minority view for sure, but one that would be held by some. Not so much historians that would hold the ancient view and the spiritual kinship, but some Baptists, particularly laymen, that would have this sense of again looking back through the eras of history and really seeing themselves in that way. The third is getting into an era that was actually an argument that historians would make, or that historians would at least explore, is the Anabaptist connection. So number three, the third theory of Baptist origins, is that Baptists essentially come out of the Radical Reformation, and that is the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists are initially emerging out of the Swiss Reformation with Ulrich Zwingli and some of the Swiss regions. Eventually they spread and become a very significant movement in the Reformation. The Radical Reformation births groups that we would still know of today, like the Amish and the Mennonites, are connected to the Anabaptist groups. And so some have made the case, of course, even the name, right? You hear Anabaptist, which means to be rebaptized. They believed in believers' baptism. So you see that, and you seize upon that, and you can say, wow, perhaps, why wouldn't we just come as Baptists? Why wouldn't we just extend from the Anabaptists? But historically, there's a lot to be said. I'm not going to take all of the time in this video. I'm tempted to, but I'm not going to take, I could take 20 minutes or more just to speak about the Anabaptist question. At the end of the day, there are some interesting connections between Baptists and the Anabaptists, not only theologically, not only in terms of emphases, but also in terms of actually some organic connections where you have a few early Baptists that are mingling with or even spending time with a few Anabaptists. And so there's some interesting things historically that could be said about that, particularly as a few Baptists leave England and go down to the Low Countries and spend some time with some Mennonites, with some Anabaptists. And so there is something of an influence there, or at least a connection there a little bit. But at the end of the day, that too, this idea that Baptists extend largely or significantly from the Anabaptists is a view I think that has significant historical problems, and theologically I think there's some significant differences between the Anabaptists and the Baptists that if we had time we could tease out. You might want to do that in a research paper sometime. And so by all means, if that's an interesting topic, do your research paper on that and explore the Anabaptist connection. But the fourth is actually closely related to the third, this idea that Baptists come out of the Protestant Reformation largely as second or even third generation Protestants. This is the view that I think is quite clear historically as you look at the best historical research over the last 50 years or so. So this is not even like a cutting edge thing. This is something that has been more settled historically. Although again, there are some who would want to see a larger Anabaptist connection. Some of you might take a Baptist history class and you're going to explore these things much in depth, but not all of you will. And so I wanted to explore some of these things. But for those of you who are interested, there is much to be studied there that is interesting and fascinating as we understand our Baptist roots. And so this fourth view, the view that I hold, the view that I think is quite compelling, I don't think that there's really any there's much discussion among mainstream historians about this. There are just primarily some outliers who would hold this other view that I mentioned, number three. But it is the view basically that Protestants in the second and third generation, that within English Protestantism, the Reformation in England, there is this larger movement called separatism, English separatism, those who are leaving the Anglican Church and forming their own denomination. Not their own denomination, that's anachronistic. Their own congregations. We call them Congregationalists or Separatists. Separatism is the idea of anyone who would come out of the Church of England. That was considered very strange and even disruptive and was looked down upon by the broader English society, for whom the Church of England was part of your birthright. To be English was to be part of the Church of England. But there are those who are going to leave the Church of England, believing it is compromised, believing that it is not Protestant enough. It has not been thoroughly reformed, not sufficiently reformed. And so there's a group that leaves this group called English separatism, and that's a quite diverse group. Some and many are Paedo-Baptists and would be like-minded with Presbyterians and would even become Presbyterians and Congregationalists, all of whom are Paedo-Baptists. But within that group, there is a group that become Baptists. And it is from this group that modern Baptists, and we can at least say it like that, are going to extend. And so within this group, you have basically developing over the next century and two centuries, the three major streams of Baptist life as it is developing. This is in the early 1600s, the 17th century, and it's from this time that these three groups begin emerging. One is called the General Baptists. This group is going to be more Arminian in their theology and is going to be, in some ways, slightly more removed from the Puritan influence, from the Puritans that are going to be a big part of this English separatism. And yet still, we could very easily overemphasize the difference between the General Baptists and the second group that I'll mention, which are the Particular Baptists. The Particular Baptists are those who are going to be more fervently Calvinistic. The General Baptists, that name comes from their view of the atonement, the idea that the atonement is general, that it is for all people, that Christ died for all people in the same way, and that the atonement covered the sins of all people rather than the elect, which the Particular Baptists, who believe that the atonement was particular, that it was focused, that it is for those who are known and chosen of God, the elect. And so the atonement becomes ultimately this phrase that is going to be used to distinguish the General and Particular Baptists. The General Baptist might be Calvinistic in other ways, for instance, on the idea of the perseverance of the saints, or on total depravity, or what have you, so on some other things. But it's on the atonement that they are general. They are more Arminian in this way. Whereas the Particular Baptists are more in line with what we have eventually, which we will eventually call 5-point Calvinism. This idea that these 5 points that summarize the teachings of John Calvin, and more broadly, the Reformed tradition, this large segment of the Protestant Reformation. And so that's two, right? In England, you have General Baptists, you have Particular Baptists. At different times, they're vying for more or less influence. The Particular Baptists are going to grow more long-term as the General Baptists begin to decline numerically. But both groups are going to have these core ideas in mind that I will eventually get to when I describe the third mainstream of Baptist life, and that is American Baptists. Now, I'm choosing to speak about it this way because in America, you could even still define, oh, look, you have General Baptists, you have Particular Baptists, and that is absolutely true. But in America, you have a semi-autonomous movement of Baptists that emerges in the 17th century and into the 18th century when it's going to grow rapidly. But in America, in the American colonies, there's no United States yet, of course, you have this movement of Baptists that emerges, largely Calvinistic. The vast majority of Baptists are going to be Calvinistic until into the 19th century, so the 1800s, and as you get into the 20th century, that changes dramatically the other way. But in these first couple 2.5 centuries, you have a majority that are, at least for 2 centuries or so, that are Calvinistic. And yet, the American Baptists are emerging sort of on their own. Again, they're not coming out of the Church of England. They're not coming out of some of the same things. Roger Williams becomes this key figure, even though he's Baptist only for a short time, the founding of these churches. So it's an interesting thing that this movement emerges in America that in some ways certainly is connected to and influenced by the Baptist movement in England, in Great Britain, the General Baptists and particular Baptists, and some of them are moving to the American colonies. So it's not to say there's no connection, but I say that American Baptists, not only do they have an interesting founding that again is semi-autonomous, but also they develop some of their own unique, again, emphases and distinctives and things like that. Yet, with each of these three groups of Baptists, there are a few key themes that I want to discuss as I come to a close. One of those things that united, and all of these things did, but the first one that I'll mention that united all Baptists was an idea of regenerate church membership. Now, this might not sound novel to you, and if so, it just simply shows the success of the Baptist movement on American religion. But it is this idea that to be a member of the church, you have to be a professing Christian. You have to be able to give a credible profession of faith and state the fact that you have been born again and that you are following after Christ. So a credible profession of faith is required. Of course, we can't know everything. We can't see into people's hearts. We can't know their innermost inklings and so on. But there has to be a credible profession of faith for someone to be a church member. In other words, you can't be born a church member. You're not a church member simply because of your parents or because of grandparents, nor can you be baptized and brought into fellowship within the church just by virtue, again, of your heritage or of your parents. But rather, one for himself or herself must give a credible profession of faith. And to remain a member, they must maintain that profession of faith and a life that gives evidence of that. So regenerate church membership is something that American, general, particular, all Baptists would have held dearly. Another is religious liberty. And it's connected. Each of these things are connected. It's this idea that for the state to enforce religion of any sort goes against the very nature of the gospel. It goes against the very kingdom of Christ, in the fact that the kingdom of Christ is not of this world. And there's some really significant reasons in these early arguments that Baptists understood and that are going to characterize the Baptist movement throughout these last 4 centuries, is going to be this idea that the best scenario is a free church and a free state. And so it is this idea that the church doesn't want the support of the state. The state has its role, it's important, and the church has its role, and it is even more important. And yet, we're not looking for endorsement from the state. We're not looking for the state to financially support us or in any way. We just want liberty and freedom to preach the gospel, to worship God, to make disciples, and that is what we believe as Baptists is the right scenario, a scenario that respects the right of conscience. And that, as one early Baptist said, forced religion stinks in the nostrils of God. At best, the state, if it tried to enforce religion, if it tried to make people Christians, all it could do is make really good hypocrites. At best, you could force outward compliance and so on. And so Baptists have held this, that religion should be free, and ultimately without any connection to the state. That's not saying that the church has nothing to say or to be involved in the state and in civil matters. Again, there's a liberty part. We can say and do and be involved in all of the ways that we should be according to the principles of the scriptures and so on. And so much more that I could say there, but religious liberty, very important in Baptist life for each of the streams of the Baptists. Another is local church autonomy. And so there's no hierarchy in Baptist life. There is no pope. There are no bishops. Even as denominations develop, each church is autonomous, and involvement and connection to that denomination is voluntary. It is primarily the connection that exists is for partnership, for ministry, for missions, and for the sharing of resources for those very purposes, for kingdom work, for benevolence, and so on. And so every church is responsible before God and will have to answer to God. They're responsible to elect their own leaders and to maintain their own leaders, or to remove their leaders when that would be necessary. Perhaps they make their own organization and so on and so forth. And their connection to other churches, as important as that is, Of course, that model is very biblical to have connection to other churches, to be partnering in those ways. It is ultimately voluntary, cannot be forced, cannot be coerced. Another thing that I would just emphasize as I say this, and I'm just mentioning a few, there are other Baptist distinctives that I could say that are equally important. But when I want to end, as I make this point that Baptists are Protestants, that Baptists are coming out of the Protestant Reformation, that each of these streams, general, particular, and in the United States, in America, from the American colonies from the beginning, Baptists have been Orthodox and they have been Protestant. And of course, even those two things are important to say in terms of their own connection. Protestants were Orthodox Christians as well. And I mean Orthodox with a small o. So in other words, Baptists have believed and affirmed and confessed, even through written confessions of faith, the principles of Christianity that have characterized the Christian church since the time of the apostles. As it says in Acts 2, that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings. These principles that have guided the church throughout its early centuries, the ecumenical councils that gave expression to these principles, such as the deity of Christ, the natures of Christ, and so on and so forth. These key principles, the personhood of the Holy Spirit, and so on. Baptists have not only believed these things, but have professed them, have preached them, have sung them. And so Baptists are not an creedal or confessional group, have not been so historically, although there have been times where you've had some movements that have, within Baptist life, leaned that way or even pressed that way. By and large, as we look at the tradition as a whole over the 4 centuries, Baptists have been proudly Protestant, first Christians first, but then also to be Protestant, to be Orthodox, to be part of this larger movement. We have not been separated from other Christian denominations and other traditions in a way that would set ourselves off in some sort of hostility or in some sort of pride, but rather we recognize how we fit into this larger story of what God has done through the church, through the people of God, even before the church, stretching back through the times of God's work among the Hebrews and among the patriarchs and so on. So Baptists have understood and have embraced the way that they fit with the larger body of Christ, even if, as I mentioned, we've not always ultimately fulfilled that in the best way. And sometimes we've been sectarian and sometimes we've been insular. But by and large, Baptists coming out of the Protestant Reformation have been a people who have understood that when they're at their best. And so I think those are important things that we think about Baptist origins. Who are Baptists? Where did they come from? What do they believe? Well, hopefully by the end of this video, you have a better sense of that, and so much more that we could explore, but I hope that this at least hits on some of the major things.